I remember the exact sound the door made when it closed behind him. It was not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet click that somehow echoed louder than anything I had ever heard. In that single moment, my entire life split into two parts, before he left and after he was gone. If someone had told me that a few words could tear a heart apart completely, I would have laughed. But that morning, standing there with our newborn twins only a few steps away, I learned just how wrong I had been. My name is Ava Carter, and there was a time when I believed love could survive anything. I believed that if two people truly cared for each other, nothing in the world could come between them. I believed that loyalty and promises actually meant something. Looking back now, I realize I was not naive because I loved deeply. I was naive because I thought the world rewarded that kind of love. I met Ethan Whitmore on a cool October afternoon in New York City, when the sidewalks were painted with fallen leaves and the air carried that quiet golden calm before winter. At the time, I had just moved to the city after finishing college, chasing a career in interior design and trying to prove something to myself. Ethan walked into my life like something out of a story, charming, effortless, and disarmingly kind. We met in a small cafe tucked between two busy streets, the kind of place people passed by without noticing. But for me, that place became the beginning of everything. Back then, he was just Ethan. He never introduced himself with his last name, never talked about his family, and never hinted at the world he came from. To me, he was just a man who smiled like he meant it and listened like what I said actually mattered. It was only later that I learned he was the only son of the Whitmore family, a name that carried weight in the real estate world across the country. They owned luxury properties, had influence in every major city, and operated in a world I had never even imagined stepping into. But by the time I learned all of that, I was already in love with him. Our relationship moved quickly, the way it often does when everything feels right. There was no hesitation, no second guessing. He made me feel safe, seen, and chosen. And for a while, I truly believed I was enough for him, regardless of where he came from or what his family expected. When I found out I was pregnant, Ethan held me so tightly I could barely breathe. His happiness felt real, overwhelming even. He promised me that nothing would change, that we would build our own life together, separate from expectations and pressure. I believed him. I wanted to believe him so badly that I ignored the small, quiet voice in the back of my mind that warned me life was never that simple. Everything changed the day I met his mother. Her name was Victoria Whitmore, and from the moment I stepped into her world, I knew I did not belong there. The house alone felt like a museum, filled with expensive art, polished marble floors, and people who spoke in careful, calculated tones. I felt like an outsider the second I walked through the door, like I had crossed into a space that was never meant for someone like me. Victoria greeted me with a smile that never reached her eyes. She studied me in a way that made me feel like I was being evaluated, not welcomed. When she found out I was pregnant, she did not react with joy or even surprise. Instead, she simply nodded, as if I were a minor inconvenience she had already anticipated. She never raised her voice. She never insulted me directly, but everything about her made it clear that I was not what she wanted for her son. After that night, Ethan started to change. It was subtle at first. He became distracted, quieter, distant in ways I could not explain. He started taking more calls from his mother, stepping out of the room to talk in hushed tones. When I asked him what was wrong, he always told me the same thing. Everything is fine. You have nothing to worry about. But I did worry. By the time I gave birth to our twins, Noah and Lily, that worry had turned into something heavier, something I could not ignore. Ethan was still there physically, still holding the babies, still smiling when he looked at them. But there was a wall between us that I could not break through. And then came that morning. He walked into our small apartment looking like a completely different person. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, and his shoulders slumped as if he had already lost a battle. I knew nothing about Dot. I remember smiling when I saw him, thinking he had come home to finally start our life together as a family. But the moment he said we need to talk, I knew something was wrong. When he told me he could not do this anymore, I felt like the ground disappeared beneath my feet. When he said he had to leave, it felt unreal, like I was watching someone else's life unfold in front of me. And when he finally admitted that his mother was right, that we did not belong in the same world, something inside me broke in a way that could never fully be repaired. He did not fight for us. He did not hesitate long enough for me to believe he might change his mind. He apologized quietly, almost like it was a formality, and then he walked out. Just like that, Noah and Lily were sleeping in their crib when the door closed. They had no idea their father had just chosen a life without them. I stood there for a long time, staring at that door, waiting for it to open again. It never did. The days that followed were the hardest of my life. I realized that I did not have the luxury of falling apart. They needed me, completely, fully, without hesitation. And no matter how broken I felt, I had to stand up for them. So I did. Finding work was harder than I expected. No one wanted to hire a new mother with twins, especially not someone who needed flexibility. I faced rejection after rejection, each one chipping away at my confidence. But I kept going, because stopping was not an option. Eventually, I found small freelance work in interior design. It was not much, but it was enough to keep us afloat. I worked late at night after the babies fell asleep, pushing through exhaustion just to make it to the next day. And then, slowly, an idea began to form. It started with something simple: baby clothes. I noticed how expensive, well-designed clothes were, and how poorly made the affordable ones felt. I remembered the sewing skills my mother had taught me when I was young, and I decided to try creating something better. At first, it was just for Noah and Lily. But when I shared photos online, people started asking where they could buy them. That was the moment everything began to change. I named the brand Little Nest. It was small at first, barely noticed, and filled with setbacks. But I kept learning, improving, and showing up every day. Slowly, orders started coming in. Then more, then more. Months passed, and what started as a desperate attempt to survive turned into something real. Then one day, everything exploded. A well-known parenting influencer shared my work, and overnight, my small brand gained attention I could never have imagined. Orders flooded in faster than I could handle. I had to find help, expand production, and learn how to run a real business almost overnight. Within a year, Little Nest was no longer just surviving, it was thriving. Years later, I stood in a completely different place in life. My children were growing up happy and loved. My business had expanded into major retail stores, and I was no longer the woman who had been left behind in that small apartment. I had rebuilt myself from the ground up. Then one day, I saw him again. Ethan stood in the park while my children played nearby. He looked older, worn down in a way I did not expect. There was regret in his eyes, the kind that does not fade easily. He told me he was sorry. He said he had been wrong. He said he had lost everything that mattered. I listened, calmly, without anger, without pain. And then I told him the truth. He was no longer part of my life, not because I hated him, but because I had moved beyond the version of myself that needed him. I walked away that day without looking back, and for the first time, I truly felt free. This was never about revenge. It was about growth, about choosing yourself when no one else does, about building a life so strong that the past no longer has the power to shake it. I did not win against him. I won against the version of me that once believed I needed him to survive.